Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So hello all. I'm going to plug in my little phone. So let me know how grainy the picture is, or if the audio is not good, in the chat, if you would. So we're just streaming as a Sunday morning talk to Cascade Hermitage and also to Clear Mountain. But once again, in general, hello everyone. In general, we will be streaming for Clear Mountain on Saturday mornings still. So this is a rare and fun exception. And then hopefully just for those at Cascade, we'll be every now and again zooming in or something like that. Okay. And it's good to see the online community there, Amy, Mary, Roy, and everyone who's at the Cascade Hermitage, who ostensibly is watching with the parents there. We had a really lovely first retreat there last weekend, and it was just heartening to see so many dedicated practitioners coming together. So, in honor of the 4th of July, I thought a good topic would be why monks can't vote or shouldn't vote, which I thought would be suitably, what's the word? Not divisive, but interesting, we'll say that, and counter to what most might think of in terms of a balanced view on one's relationship to political action and social justice in general. There was a recent not flood, but emphasis, I think, in several areas in recent months and years on a certain figure in the American cultural milieu of Dolly Parton. So I don't know if anyone was privy to that, but she became held up in recent years as one of the few figures in the landscape of the US who somehow transcended the political division which has fractured and damaged so much of our society. I remember I returned back to the US on election night this last autumn, and I felt like I came home to a different America. People were so worried and frightened, and the political divides that had always been there seemed much deeper. I think this is for a few reasons. I think that we've lost the canopies of meaning that for so many millennia gave our hearts a trajectory, a structure, and a container which honored and channeled and crystallized their highest aspiration and allowed them to move towards that in us and in them, which is, and which we know to be most worthy, namely awakening and the purification of the heart. And I think with the dissolution of so many religious structures, many of which were problematic in many ways. People were left largely bereft, and when that happens, ideology takes on power, and uh, what grounds us most um, dissolves. And I think then people do try to channel their aspirations and spirits and lives towards those things which truly are good, but which are also limited. And I think you see this in political figure after political figure. Is I remember reading about various politicians or activists throughout history. And in so many cases, those who devoted themselves completely to an ideal, frequently the movement fails, or it succeeds, but with a dark side that they didn't expect, or they burn out. And you see the fragility of such a life. And I always left with the taste of bitterness on my tongue from those narratives. The intuition that something had not been honored as much as it could have, or that something hadn't flourished or flowered like it might have in terms of a life, an aspiration, or uh, a love of truth. And the exceptions to these for me always were those figures who remembered the transcendent and the spiritual aspect of their beings and of their paths as paramount, and the social side as a powerful and yet secondary part of what it meant to be human. So the Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King. All of these, I think, held the divine and the human capacity for compassion and their own spiritual journey as the prime narrative of their lives. And that included within it this powerful call to social action. And this strikes me as the correct relationship in the human heart. And yet, if if the path and the way of training the heart has not been clearly articulated and given weight, then it is very difficult for that to serve as a container and a larger paradigm. Because however much we appreciate vague admonitions towards spirituality, or some line about how nature is my church, and not that that's not true, but when that's all one's spiritual life consists of, it's a pretty simple and limited articulation. So this is something I really appreciate about Buddhism, is it provides a narrative and a structure and infusion of meaning for life that is quite palatable to the modern mind. This is how we approach our suffering, and this is how we train our mind. And we do not ask that you absorb or subscribe to a great deal of ontological hypotheses in order to practice this path. So, Dolly Parton was relevant in that she seems to be the one figure in American politics which transcends politics. At a Dolly Parton concert, you meet the drag queens standing next to the, hardcore Republican from down south next to the liberal from Seattle, whatever stereotypes you want to throw into that mix. They seem to all exist somehow at a Dolly Parton concert. And there's a beauty in that. And the thing is, for millennia, this has been the role of the Sangha, is The Sangha don't get involved in politics for a few reasons. One is there is a true value in having some element of society which transcends the political, and where everyone can enter into a space and be not this or that, but just human, and in this case, just Buddhist. And in the case of in Thailand, that really is the case. The monasteries have served as these places of forgiveness and conversation and communication when every other political divide, which are very real in Thailand, has torn people. The monasteries have served as this location where everyone can still speak, where even political, those politicians who have had corruption in their life can ordain, and where society as a whole can forgive them. And that happens. And this reminds me of a story I heard recently where Longpo Sumedho, one of the senior monks in our tradition, was speaking about what came to his mind more and more during his first years at Amravati, the monastery he started in England. And he speaks about how he became enamored with the figure of the stupa, of the temple, which is a pyramidal figure. And he said that he looked around him in England and all architecture was earthbound. It consisted of the four directions, north, south, east, west. And what was so moving to him about this figure of the pyramid, of the temple, of the steeple, was the fifth point of transcendence, which guides and unifies and gives purpose to every one of those other four earthbound planes and directions. And this is in a society where that center point, that hub, that fifth point has been forgotten, then what can happen but schism? And what can happen but each of those four directions feeling themselves to be separate? So in Thailand, the monasteries really do serve as this moment and place of meeting and of neutrality. And this is where communication happens. Ironically, that's almost where perhaps the most powerful political transformation occurs, because people can actually speak and remember that they are human. And the other reason the Sangha does not get involved in politics, or monks can't vote, and nuns, is, or shouldn't, is because it opens them up, the Sangha as a whole, up to vulnerability. If the Sangha aligns itself with one political side and the other side comes to power, then they have the ability to wipe out the institution in one fell swoop. And this has happened in China. The Taoists and the Buddhists were in conflict for millennia, and frequently whole swaths of one religion or the other would be demolished by an emperor or an empress coming to power who had faith in one and not the other. And one might say that this is an acceptable risk in order to stand up for what is right. But I think it's important to recollect the preciousness of the Dhamma, and that there needs to be some thread that carries it through. The Buddha set up this institution to last, and to outlast empires, and it has. Buddhism and the Sangha is humanity's oldest continuous institution, except for the Jains, who beat us by a few years, which I always mention. And this has been allowed in part because it's considered to be something that transcends the political. And every side, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, deserves the Dhamma. And we are all first and foremost human. Moreover, the issues which the political speaks to, monastics can speak to in more vague terms. We can tell people to not kill, to not take life, to not discriminate, etc. And um, people can connect the dots. They're smart, you know. But the chance to articulate, we monks get to be passionate about a few things and to speak passionately about them, or not passionately, but with utter, to feel free to speak and to advise people to hold the precepts, to meditate, to cultivate loving kindness. And this is our place. The final reason is that within monasteries, living close to one another, because the paramount goal is to bring the mind to calm, those fractures do fracture monasteries down the center and compromise everyone's practice. And not that there's not room for such conversation at times, but that it can't, because you're all being bonded together through this spiritual aspiration, then holding that constantly to the fore and valuing that ability to come to realization. And anything that gets in the way of that should be approached with caution. And one, I remember that when I came back to the US in the midst of its political upheaval, Ajahn Siripano said, look, you can look at what's happening there, but your job as a monk, and I would say as a practitioner, is not to let it give rise to even one unwholesome mind state. So that's a tall order. And yet, I think how this is relevant is the microcosm. So this is the macrocosm. In society, there's a place for a renunciant figure. There's a place for an institution that protects the transcendent, holds it, and gives it weight. There's a place for an area where people can meet outside of a Dolly Parton concert and just be human. And yet on the microcosm of our daily lives and our spirits and how we live, it's deeply important, I think, to keep that fifth point in our lives constantly and to recognize that vague recollections about it won't bolster it to the extent necessary for it to hold its own against the world. That the weight of the worldly narratives and what's given to them is so great that in order to remember what in your heart is most transcendent and worthy and must be the guiding star, that you have to also give it concrete weight through concrete means. So this involves props. And as Longpo Pasano says, the props come in handy. So, and we have props already. I point to this sometimes, the fact that what's highest in most houses is the liquor shelf, the liquor cabinet. What looks most like a shrine is our TV. What looks most like ritual is how we dress up for and root for our favorite football team, which is very much a ritual. What looks most like pilgrimage is how we go rafting, or go out into the woods, which is worthy. But to consciously make the effort to surround and ennoble what we most value in our lives through concrete means is important. So to take the top shelf in your house, or to install a small shelf or platform on the wall, and to install a Buddha image there, something really beautiful, with flowers that you give it every day, incense that you burn in front of it every day, a candle you light every day, even for a few minutes, to remember what it is that your life deserves to be dedicated to. And for those who have a more secular bent, this doesn't have to be a Buddha image. And certainly even us Buddhists don't conceive of that only as the teacher that was Siddhartha Gautama before he became enlightened, but rather as the transcendent quality of knowing and the purified heart. So whatever image serves that function for you, that you should use. If one can dedicate a whole room to spiritual practice, that's even better. If one can print out pictures of teachers that one really values and place them on the shrine, that's important. I do that with, I think I have a picture of Longpo Mun, Longpo Pasano, Ajahn Anan, and Ajahn Chah. I had many more, but there was just too many, so I had to just pick 4 on my shrine every day. And as soon as I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is I bow. And before I go to sleep, the last thing I do is I bow. And I ask for guidance so that I may serve the Dhamma better. And that's something everyone can do. And there are other structures one can put into one's life to remember the transcendent, to remember the 5th point. Taking 1 day a week as a Sabbath, an Uposatha day. This was recommended by the Buddha, where one holds more precepts and dedicates one's life to practice. Or even one thing I forgot to mention is on that shrine, having a small place below it where one puts a picture of those who have passed and burns a candle for them sometimes to remember. That's something that's been lost in our culture. And keeping meditation always as a prop, quote unquote, in the schedule, and remembering that that's basic hygiene, and that without that container, then the most subtle and most important and precious part of our spirits gets lost. So it's almost because of its subtlety and its refinement that it needs more protection. It's such a delicate flower that we have to raise careful and studiously built fences around it. And I think it's why, for example, the Buddha took the spiritual goal and path and surrounded it with what can seem to be such a Baroque trapping or a Baroque container of the figure of, say, the monastic and how we are meant to stand out, the robes, the shaved head, the number of rules. It's almost because of the subtlety of what was being pointed to, there was a need for even more of a carefully constructed container. And I think looking to how we can build that in our lives is essential, because not much else in our lives is helping to protect that aspiration. And a large part of that is tapping into community and coming together and remembering. So I'm not against going to Dolly Parton concerts. I can't go personally, but people could do that. But also remembering not only the institution that points to the transcendent, but what in our own lives holds that. And that this is what helps us stay on the course. And that without that, it's very hard to keep that compass pointing in the right direction. So on this 4th of July, I wish everyone the best of luck finding independence from all clinging and from greed, hatred, and delusion. So I think we have a chance for a Q&A and discussion. I think the Cascade Hermitage folks will pop back on screen now if you want. Know that this is being live streamed, so if you want to wait for questions to ask off live stream, we can just wait until we go off live stream. And people in the chat can also speak up. I'll have to use the iPhone mic so I can hear, so my sound quality may decrease. Okay. How's that? Can you hear me, Deb?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Kyle, Ian, the person way in the back who might be Mara. I'm not sure. Hello. How's the lag?
It's fine. No lag.
Okay. Oh, Ayatata just joined us. If everyone could pay respects to her, she's an extremely senior nun in our tradition who more or less brought the Bhikkhuni ordination back to the West, and it's quite an honor to have her comment on her stream. Aya, Namaste Khan. We have a few questions in chat, which maybe I could speak to. Uh, but first of all, does anyone have something to bring up, just who's there at the Hermitage? And if not, then I'll speak to something in the chat. Okay, so one question in the chat, which we can speak to really quickly. Would love to hear a recommended approach to discouragement when some negative habits of mine seem incredibly stuck. Well, discouragement itself is negative too, I guess. Hmm. I really love the quote from Ajahn Chah that 80% of the practice is knowing that we should let go of something and not being able to. It's a really humanizing thing because I think we all find ourselves in that situation often. And yeah, I'd say really having, cultivating metta on a daily basis is helpful just to soften the edges of that self critical mind. Um, And I'd also say, though, that so frequently the focus on renouncing bad habit needs to be supplemented very intentionally with the language of cultivating good habit to replace it. And that, when the Buddha spoke about abandoning unwholesome states, he spoke about seeing the drawback, seeing the benefit, or the attraction, the asada in Pali, and then the escape, uh, the nisarana. And I think that's an important trifecta. I think it's called the gratification trio. And sometimes it's complemented by two other contemplations where one sees the arising and the passing away of the negative state as well, which leads to a gratification pentad or something. Um, and to see, contemplating each of those very carefully, like what does this negative habit leave you feeling like the next day? And sometimes that contemplation just has to happen again and again, for it to really sink in. And sometimes, and meditation will help with that in terms of feeling what what it does to the mind and our sense of morality, when we do trespass on what we know we should do or shouldn't. And but the other contemplation of looking at the attraction of those states, that's something that gets missed. So what is it that we're feeding on in those states? And frequently it's as simple as the sensual pleasure of going for the extra piece of cake or, you know, drinking again. But sometimes it's much different. Sometimes it's not the pleasure so much, say, as the desire to disappear. And frequently greed and losing oneself in an experience actually is the desire to not be. And really being able to parse that out and then taste the feeling of the attraction. Like what does it sound like that's drawing you to it? And frequently the voice of defilement will sound oily, like Mara's voice, we say. Not Mara there at Cascade Hermitage, sorry. But there's an oily kind of con artist feel to that narrative that tries to push you to do something. And you can really getting to know this figure in you, is helpful. And seeing the, say, rush that comes with self-righteous anger before you blow up at someone, like what's the attraction? Because we need
pleasure. And we can't expect ourselves to renounce these means we've had for so many years of getting it without giving ourselves something else. Our hearts are starving. So to not only see what that's giving us, but also to really consciously acknowledge that we need something, and then to cultivate these other things in our lives that can replace it. So not to expect oneself to, give up the, negative fantasy right off the bat, but you might really have to consciously replace it with a good fantasy of something powerful, or a dhamma talk, skillful means. But cultivating the bright helps get rid of the dark. And that cultivation has to be very conscious too, I think. So, sometimes being with good friends or something can help as well. Those are some recollections. Any other things people would like to discuss at the Hermitage specifically?
Nisabho, we're going to, if you can hear us, we're going to turn off our camera because you're freezing up.
Oh, is the lag that bad? That's a problem. Any other questions at the Hermitage? I think you muted yourself as well, Dad. That's not good. I can't hear you if you did have questions. So you can remove your... Oh, no, you disappeared. Oh, no, you're still there. Okay. Here. So you're on the stream, but you're muted. So feel free to unmute and ask questions. In the meantime, I'll maybe talk to one more question from the chat. Mary says that voting would also require taking a position. Would that pose a danger for getting caught in the thicket of views and bound to more worldly issues? And apparently I spoke to this a little bit after submitting the question. Yeah, I think it would. And yet we exist in this thicket of views. And that if you want to, oh, you just, you got rid of me.
Sorry.
If you get rid of your video, but keep your audio, that'll let you ask questions.
Okay, you just froze up for a while, so.
Okay. That's
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Okay.
Just to finish the thing I was talking about with Mary, though, is that, we do exist in this thicket of the world, and we do have to navigate those views. But I think the difference is just remembering the transcendent in the midst of that, and really understanding that as practitioners, we have a duty to prioritize the state of our heart. So if one is checking the news feed every few hours, or even to an extent every day, then you're really deep in that thicket and you will get torn by those thorns. So I think that the issue is finding a balance where you can remember your heart above that thicket, and Ajahn Pasano has great advice around interaction with news and media. And he says, pick one issue that you can make a difference with and really learn a lot about that. But then with so many of the other issues, which we can't actually affect in a regular way, then do take a step back and don't keep up with the news cycle at that day-to-day, hour-to-hour level, because that will affect your heart. And it's hard not to get lost in the thicket. So I think just remembering how we prioritize these different parts of our lives and ethical action, and the spiritual has to hold the political.
Nisabho,
Cascade Hermitage, I can hear you if you have anything.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you talk about unwholesome mind states? So you're talking about the advice you got about when you read news or see news, don't let one unwholesome mind state arise, and how far does that go? How subtle is it?
Does anyone at the Cascade Hermitage have an answer for that one? I'd like to hear Mater's answer.
How far does it go?
What do you mean by, what do you think of in terms of unwholesome mind states? Or how not to let those arise?
Come closer so people can hear you. Well, I guess in my experience of unwholesome mind states, I sense it in my body first. So it's the noticing in my body of something that feels amiss, and then that tunes me into the mind state. But in my experience, it often doesn't start with my mind being aware of my mind, and then I'd be curious to hear other people's answers. My mind has never tuned me into my mind very well.
The mind has never tuned you into the mind very well. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I like that. That's very, yes, that is probably true. There's a quote I like to reference from the Dubliners that Ajahn Amaro speaks to, where he says that Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from himself, viewing his thoughts and actions with suspicious sidelong glances. And I've always, I think that, if the only way to get around that dynamic might be through the body frequently. So
I find that I often notice I'm not breathing. Like it's something as simple as being like, oh, you're not even breathing right now. And that's usually what tunes me into it.
Ian, do you have any thoughts?
Let's move up so people can hear you because it's this mic.
I like what Mara says about the sense, the body's, the bodily sense, and that arises. That must arise from tension, some sense of tension, and so it makes me think about how mind is so involved in tension and resolving tension, and at work at doing that, and develops all kinds of strategies. And this might be where one could pay attention.
I think that's a really interesting point. Because another word for tension would be stress, and another, the Pali equivalent to stress is dukkha, suffering. And so often the beginning point of the cycle that gives rise to increased suffering and compounds it in terms of the 12 links of dependent origination is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, namely of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. So I think you're right. Like, so often those unwholesome mind states do originate from want. And instead of really looking at that craving, we, move out trying to find a way to fill that hole. That's good. And I think in terms of how it manifests in looking at like this political thing, Dad, that you're referencing, and what it means to not let one unwholesome mind state arise. There's something, I think that Ajahn Chah would say, like, you can learn someone was worried, a monk was really worried about leaving the monastery with, and his teacher, Ajahn Chah. And Ajahn Chah said, no, it's fine. There's 6 ajahns where you're going. And the monk was like, what? It's like this monastery in the middle of nowhere. What are you talking about? And Ajahn Chah was like, no, you have, your ajahn eyes, your ajahn ears, your Ajahn nose, your Ajahn taste. There's the 6 sense bases, and that he's always learning Dhamma. And Ajahn Mun, one of the fathers of our lineage, was confronted in that way too by the senior monk who from the city was basically like, who do you go to ask when you need advice, in a very kind of accusatory way. And Longpor Mun said, look, I'm always hearing the Dhamma. And my sense is that there's really, in every situation, there is this kernel of truth and learning that's available. And so often the route to it is through the Four Noble Truths, specifically looking to that tension or stress or suffering in something. So like, so often I find when I'm speaking to someone and the conversation is just empty, really asking that person questions and getting to some real raw point, what their suffering is. Like, there's a real conversation waiting there to be had with almost everyone, even the most kind of shallow or tuned out person. There's the spirit is there to be found, but so often you have to pass through that first noble truth to get to it. And similarly with the politics, it's so easy to become angry at this or that, machination of a political party or something. But if you look to the suffering behind it, what's happening in the Rust Belt and who are these people suffering? What's happening in the cities with people being alienated and where is their suffering? If you look past the manifestation, this what we call the sankhara, the formation, to the suffering that gives rise to it, compassion is there, and the whole path is right there waiting. So that's, I think, the most powerful way to not let an unwholesome mind state arise is using the Four Noble Truths and remembering the power of our shared humanity as embodied in our shared vulnerability, stress, and suffering. Anyone want to discuss more things? I'm curious about anyone's thoughts on that more so, and yeah, or other things.
Yeah, what do you feel about capitalism?
Capitalism? Who asked that?
Rolls.
Nice. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of, unconstrained capitalism certainly is not good. Unconstrained communism has led to hundreds of millions of deaths. I think somewhere in the middle probably is about where we're headed or could be in terms of the broader society. But I think, how we interact with that is really, that we can occupy spaces in any system which are transcendent in their essence. And how far we want to take that is, a constant tension, I think. But one thing I really do appreciate about Buddhism is an acknowledgement that the world, we try to fix it and help, but to an extent, the world will be the world. And not to let go of trying to change things, but also just to protect some refuge in our heart and to remember that, things were brutal in the Buddhist time as they're brutal now. But I think also protecting our path through that and remembering the highest values, that's important. But I'd be very interested to hear what Madhura has to say on this one, because we've spoken about it recently.
On capitalism, I think it's our relationship to it, right? I don't know. I mean, I work in sectors that are very high capitalist, and lately Nisabho and I have been having conversations about like how can I have a different relationship. So that I feel like there's the system and then there's the relationship that you might have, which feels a bit different.
There's a beautiful sorry, Madhura, if you want to speak more, I don't want to cut you off.
No?
There's a beautiful sutta where the Buddha references this. It's considered the most pure life that a lay person can live. And it's this, I think he's a non-returner or a once returner from the past, the time of previous Buddha. And he makes his living by making pottery out of termite mound earth because he doesn't want to disturb the earth. That was a thing in the Buddha's time. But he sort of stays at home to care for his parents, and he practices constantly. I think he always wears white. I'm not sure about that one. But he places his wares out by the street, and those who want to take them take what they want, and then they leave him gifts and his livelihood that way. I don't know if that is practicable for everyone, but I did find it as a beautiful example of someone making a space of some other space within the system. And I think generosity has that ability to transcend that transactional paradigm that's so easily laid over everything. And so I think any moment of generosity transcends capitalism or communism or whatever. In that moment, it speaks to the transcendent in such a powerful voice that, you know, those smaller voices of these other things can't, you know, don't, they get drowned out for a second by the roar of the human spirit. Any other things people want to discuss, or should we wrap it up?
It feels to me, Nisabho, that you're speaking truth to power. And this conversation about politics, just
What do you mean by that? Can you expand? I don't really know that term, although I've heard it before.
Well, I'm just following a thread that Rolls started in my head with his question. I don't think you can necessarily separate capitalism from politics, and you can't separate either of them from our relationship, as Mara speaks, to power and the issues of power as an expression of ritual. And part of what you're talking about is how we focus our attention to in a ritual way to these questions of power. And where and in that relationship to spirit and the states that we exist in and how they can lead towards transcendence. That's what hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, maybe you can give the talk next time. That was really lovely.
No, I'm just trying to take in what you're speaking to with gratitude.
No, likewise, and I think that's a beautiful way of phrasing it. You know, the ritual of capitalism, our relationship to it, and then all these other factors playing in and navigating them. Do you have any thoughts on yurt raising, Ian? My parents are raising the yurt this next week, so I want to any spiritual metaphor that could be applied to the coming days. Or non-spiritual reflections are okay too.
At some time, at some point, are you gone?
Oh no, I'm back. Sorry. Sorry.
I would love to hear and talk about the communication that you see that happens in the Sangha that can be transformative. The engagement, as we're doing in this moment, but more of what you can see in that way. I'm excited to think about that kind of conversation and dialogue, that kind of communication that can happen, and how it can be, as you say, healing and transformative. Anyway,
Can you connect that to your raising as a
Am I what?
metaphor? Raising as a metaphor.
yes, and the lattice that forms the walls of the earth.
All right, nice.
Well, or no, that's beautiful, and also the shared sense of, the Amish barn raising, is a phrase that people know for a reason. I mean, there's something really significant about coming together and contributing to something, and how that binds one, and in shared humanity. And yeah, that's worth a great deal. I think a yurt's a little easier than a barn, but I'm actually not sure about that, especially since my dad's never done it before. So,
Easier.
so, um, yeah, and I think a great deal goes on through that. Um, and just with a shared purpose, things, people align, and so many of these things fall away, the divisions. Um, and just to say, yeah, that the place for communication, as you said, it occurs in many ways, and one of those ways is ritual. So there's a story of Ajahn Chah going to give a talk to a military platoon or something, and he made every one of them take off their boots before they listened to the Dhamma as a sign of respect. So like, just this whole like huge number of soldiers like unlacing their boots and taking them off and then listening. And like, it was not, I think, probably a comfortable moment for anyone, but Ajahn Chah didn't care. I mean, he's he's done his work. But he I think that sends such a strong signal in the heart and in society, and that's a powerful mode of communication. And yeah, if the transcendent is given that place at the head of the table, then all the kids sitting at the rest of the table, I think, quiet down a little and realize they've got to be a bit, restrain themselves for the sake of the dinner, to use a metaphor, which is completely unworkable for monks who don't eat dinner. But speaking of which, I actually do have to go take the meal. So, and as do you all.
Thank you, Nisabho.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck out there. I hope your raising goes well, and the heat's not too bad. And Kyle, I'm really glad you came. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk last time, but maybe another one of these days we can talk about writing and all that fun stuff.
Sure thing.
All right, cool. Okay.